What if Germany had won the Second World War? Not in a dramatic final battle or a single decisive moment, but through a slow collapse of its enemies, exhaustion on the Eastern Front, a negotiated peace in the West, and the survival of the Nazi state into the post-war world. To imagine this scenario correctly, we must strip away fantasy and propaganda and look instead at ideology, logistics, demographics, and power. A German victory would not have created a stable empire or a peaceful new order. It would have reshaped the 20th century into a far darker, more fragile, and permanently violent age, where the war never truly ended, only changed its form. A German victory in Europe would begin with domination, not harmony. The Nazi state was not designed to rule through cooperation or consent. Its ideology was built on hierarchy, racial conflict, and perpetual expansion. Victory would have expanded these principles across the continent. Western Europe would survive as a collection of hollowed-out states, technically autonomous but economically and militarily subordinate to Berlin. France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Scandinavia would exist as managed territories, their governments tolerated only as long as they served German interests. Elections would be meaningless, resistance would never fully disappear. Every city would live under surveillance, occupation forces, and fear, because the system itself depended on control rather than legitimacy. Eastern Europe would experience something far worse. Germany's real plans for the East were not hidden or theoretical. They were written, approved, and partially implemented even before victory was secured. Under Generalplan Ost, vast regions of Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia were to be cleared of their populations through mass murder, starvation, deportation, and enslavement. Tens of millions of people were marked for removal to make room for German settlers. Cities would be reduced to labor depots, entire cultures would be erased. A German victory would not soften this policy, it would accelerate it. With no Red Army to stop them and no Allied pressure from the West, the machinery of destruction would operate without interruption. Genocide would not have ended in 1945, it would have expanded. The Holocaust was not a desperate act of a regime under threat, it was a central goal. Victory would have validated the ideology behind it. Jewish communities across Europe and beyond would face complete annihilation. Roma populations, disabled people, political dissidents, and entire categories of humanity deemed undesirable would be systematically eliminated. The scale of death would not slow down after the war, it would increase, because victory removes restraint. When power faces no consequences, brutality becomes routine. Inside Germany itself, life would not resemble the triumphant images often imagined. The Nazi state thrived on mobilization and crisis. It required enemies to justify control. Even in victory, the population would remain under strict surveillance, censorship, and ideological pressure. Freedom of speech would not return, political debate would not reopen, the economy would remain militarized, focused on armament, infrastructure for conquest, and population engineering. Germans would live in a society permanently preparing for the next conflict, because peace would threaten the regime's legitimacy. Technology would advance rapidly, but without moral boundaries. A victorious Germany would pour resources into jet aircraft, long-range missiles, chemical weapons, and eventually nuclear research. Scientific talent would be centralized and controlled by the state. Innovation would serve power, not people. Medicine, engineering, and physics would be shaped by ideology, with entire fields distorted or destroyed if they conflicted with racial doctrine. The idea that scientific progress automatically benefits humanity would collapse in such a world. Knowledge would exist, but it would belong to the regime. The global balance of power would fracture rather than stabilize. A German-dominated Europe would not coexist peacefully with other major powers. The United States, even if it accepted a negotiated peace, would face a hostile authoritarian superstate controlling the industrial heart of the old world.
The Soviet Union, if partially defeated or pushed beyond the Urals, would remain a wounded, vengeful rival. Japan would dominate East Asia, but clash with German ambitions over resources and influence. Instead of one Cold War, the world would enter a multi-sided confrontation with shifting alliances and constant proxy conflicts. Colonial empires would not collapse in this timeline. The wave of decolonization that followed Allied victory depended on exhausted European powers and the moral collapse of imperial ideology. A victorious Germany would reinforce colonial rule. Africa would be carved into zones of extraction and settlement. Indigenous resistance movements would be crushed with extreme violence. Asia would remain divided between Japanese domination and Western imperial control. The idea of national self-determination would be delayed by decades, perhaps permanently. There would be no United Nations as we know it, no universal declaration of human rights, no global framework to restrain war crimes or genocide. International law would exist only as a tool of power. Smaller states would survive only by aligning themselves with stronger patrons. Neutrality would be impossible. Every nation would be forced to choose sides in an unstable, militarized world. Economically, the German Empire would face long-term contradictions. Conquest brings resources, but it also brings resistance. Maintaining control over vast hostile territories requires enormous military and administrative effort. Forced labor is inefficient. Racial policies undermine productivity. Corruption grows inside authoritarian systems. Over time, the costs of empire would rise faster than its benefits. Victory would not solve Germany's structural weaknesses, it would magnify them. Culturally, the world would become narrower and poorer. Art, literature, and philosophy flourish under freedom and exchange. In a German-dominated world, culture would be filtered through ideology. Entire traditions would disappear. Languages would be suppressed. History would be rewritten continuously to serve power. Memory itself would become a battlefield. Most importantly, a German victory would not end war, it would normalize it. Expansion was not a temporary phase of Nazi ideology, it was its core. Once one enemy was defeated, another would be needed. The regime could not survive without conflict. The result would be a world locked in permanent tension, where peace was an illusion and violence a constant background condition. In this alternate history, the 20th century does not lead toward greater freedom or cooperation. It hardens into an age of fear, hierarchy, and endless struggle. Technology advances, but humanity retreats. Borders shift, but suffering remains constant. The war does not conclude with victory or defeat. It simply continues under a different name. This is why the question, what if Germany won World War II, is not a question about who would rule the world. It is a question about whether the world itself could remain livable. A German victory would not create order. It would create a future defined by domination, resistance, and endless violence. The fact that this future did not come to pass is not an accident of history. It is one of the defining turning points of the modern world.